Last week I looked into digital transformation in great detail, and what I'd like to talk to you about is insights and lessons learned in implantology, ceramic implantology, and tomography. I'm going to do this in my function as the president of ISME. I'd like to pass on the learnings from 20 years of implanting ceramic. You will see animations, patients, x-rays from SDS patients, but that's just one way of interpreting these cases. Other implant providers will have drawn their own conclusion, which are equally valid. So what I'd like to forward to you is my theory here. I'm just claiming this. It's a theory, an assumption. A hypothesis is an assumption. And over the past 30 years, I was quite good at anticipating what was around the corner at the time with amalgam, but the same applied to ceramic. And my hypothesis today is, what will implantology look like in 2040, for example? This year, I was invited as a keynote speaker at the Straumann Innovation and Technology Summit and talked about the same aspect. And here's my hypothesis: navigated immediate implantation of ceramic implants at tissue level with immediate restoration, including the use of blood concentrates and micronutrients, represents the future of implantology. I'm not talking about tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. I'm talking about the next 20 years. I'll be able to show you the reasoning behind my assumption, behind my hypothesis. From Professor Skibitsky, I heard that the people out there do what they've always done if they could have done it, even though they might not have wanted it at a different point in time. But now they can. If people had been able to fly 5,000 years ago, they would have flown 5,000 years ago. They didn't have the possibility to do it. Here's Leonardo da Vinci's flying device, 1490. It took another 400 years before the first vehicle took off. But if they had had titanium or carbon fibers, they would have perhaps been more successful. And I'm sure dentists would have used ceramic implants much earlier if it had been available in sufficient quality. We know that from Schulte and colleagues. And I'd like to come up with another quote, which reads as follows. It's from a pioneer in the automobile industry, Henry Ford. If I had asked people what they wanted to have, they would have said faster horses. My claim is that empirical results and scientific evidence are like siblings, brother and sister. Joachim Mutter was one of my lecturers, one of my trainers. I'm sure you know him. I brought him into my Konstanz clinic. He was an environmental doctor, and he said, Ulrich, the basic principle of medicine is as follows: observe, recognize or identify, act and prove. And he said, think of thalidomide. We realized that when pregnant women took a particular drug, their babies were born without arms and without legs. There was a report in Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, the big quality newspaper, on Saturday, and on Monday, thalidomide was banned in Germany. And another example how evidence was toppled over in science. Over the past 18 months, you were able to experience that. We have a non-tested, non-evident vaccine. I'm not either advocating or criticizing vaccinations. I'm completely neutral. But think of what happened. This was the biggest human experiment that ever happened. Very simply because we thought this is an emergency case. There is no other way. It just has to stop. The lockdowns have to stop. And we have to go forward despite a lack of evidence. Now, of course, we would have liked to have a 5-year double-blind randomized control trial with mRNA, great in gene therapy. But the question is, can we also apply this in a non-individualized fashion? So empirical results are equally important. If we just assumed the evidence-based approach, we would have tested different horses from Greece, from the US, from Argentina. Which ones are the fastest, require less food or feed, and have more range? He didn't care about that. He triggered a revolution. The revolution is always triggered by empirical results. Revolution is the result of empirical results. Evolution is the result of scientific evidence. And we're now going to deliver the scientific evidence, but it's easier to deliver scientific evidence given the empirical results we have, 150,000 implants. So we already know what's going to happen, what evidence will tell us. So I'm also going to try and advocate the empirical approach. As you know, I am very much empirically based. To the left, we can see design. And what do we see to the right? User experience. This is a really interesting photograph. Very often the user experience deviates completely from design. What is user experience? User experience encompasses all points of contact and interactions of the user with a product or company. We as organizations will be measured against what? Against the iPhone. Because our entire brain has changed. The younger generations have a completely different brain. We are measured against the convenience of the iPhone. And if the user experience an organization provides, an implant company, a particular procedure or technology, is completely out of proportion to the user experience the current generation has with the iPhone, we will miss a particular development. Digital dentistry is just a perfect example. And if you miss this boat, you will just not be part of business anymore. You could also explain design, exchange the term design by the term science. And the user experience can be replaced by the term patient. Patients told us, we want ceramics. Patients came to me and said, Ulrich, we want ceramic implants. Now, I was lucky that I knew the owner of Metoxit, one of the market leaders, that they produced a hip replacement, and he said, no problem, Mr. Volz, we can get it done. This is how it all started. Perhaps we can also change or use different terms, because what I'd like to do now is to talk about generations. To the left, we may have the baby boomers who grew up with strict parents and rigid rules. And perhaps here we're talking about generations X, Y, Z. To the left, we have the baby boomers. We used to have Märklin model railways. We played with Fischer Technic construction toys. What about today's generation? This is what they play with. They play with the iPhone. Nobody is trying to fit a new exhaust pipe to their engine-powered bicycle. Let's take a look at the different generations, because I think it's really interesting. I'm just part of this generation, born in '64, baby boomers. They're 58 to 74 today. At the time, parents were poor and felt poor after World War II. These people were well-versed, liked to turn screws and to play around producing their own technology. They still listen to the radio, they still watch television, they still read newspapers on paper, printed newspapers. What's the difference between a father with a newspaper in front of his head or a father with a mobile phone in his hand? It's just the same thing. In the year 1800, urgent warning was issued by the world of science, an addiction to reading. Young people spent hours and hours on the settee and read Karl novels about native Indians and the Wild Wild West. Now, if you look back, you wouldn't understand what this was all about. Today, our children do something else. It's not necessarily wrong. It's just different. It's happening. We can't stop it. This generation, these were workaholics. I'm part of this generation as well. I also belong to the next generation a little bit. What was typical here was the full ashtray. In the middle of the night, they worked their socks off, and they placed work before personal health. And this is what we benefit from today, because they all end up on our chair with all their teeth destroyed, and we've got wonderful, lovely restorations to look after. But they will die out. They're already 58. They won't be there forever. They've got a few more years. They earned a lot of money because they were workaholics. And they are on Facebook. Now let's move on to Generation X, which I just missed because I was born 1 year earlier. That's 1965 to 1979. Generation X grew up at a time when parents felt poor, but they were rich already. There was already quite a bit of prosperity despite some recession and some economic downturns, but they still felt poor. What was the reaction? They were economical, they were cautious and prudent in consumption. This is how Generation X grew up. They had work-life balance, proper work-life balance. They managed to strike a balance between working and enjoying life. They didn't attribute more priority to work over health. They said we need both. We need to work, of course, but we need to be healthy as well. Quality of life. I don't want to neglect my family, but I would still like to enjoy what I do for a living. They were independent, autonomous, and generally they use YouTube. Then we have Generation Y, also known as the Millennials. 1980 to 1994. My daughters just about missed this bracket, but when I performed my analysis, I realized we brought them up in a fairly conservative way. They got their first iPhone only at the age of 14, so they somehow belong to Generation X as well. Generation Y, that's the children growing up at the time when parents were rich and felt rich. This was the Golf generation, Golf the car, the VW car, Golf. They all bought a house on Mallorca, the Balearic Islands in the Mediterranean. They had a lot of money. This is how this generation grew up. Work-life integration was what this was all about. They were born in a time before the digital age, but they grew up in the digital age. They have excellent work-life integration. They bring everything together, living casually and working efficiently. They post something on Instagram, something they saw or did last evening. But in the meantime, they also respond to business emails. I can see that with my daughters. We're basically online 24 hours. Everything is solved digitally. They've had a very good education. Most of them have spent some time abroad in the US or somewhere else around the world. They love to work from home. They are excellent top workers, networkers, team workers, and they are mainly on Instagram. That's interesting, isn't it? Now we move on to the next generation, Generation Z or Generation Z. It's a completely different generation. They were born after 1995. Our daughters theoretically belong to this generation, but we brought them up fairly conservatively. And what's interesting here is that Generation Y, the millennials, say, well, I'm going to be even more strict with my children, more strict than the Generation Alpha, which is what we have now as of 2010. They will have even better education, but they won't be as confident, as optimistic. Generation Z grew up in the fake area, in fake times. Parents felt rich, but they were actually poor because you have a mortgage, which is, of course, leveraged, borrowed money. You've got a car which doesn't really belong to you because you have a leasing contract, etc. And there's work-life separation. We need to know that as employers. They don't want to take work back home. They want to work at the office and then go home and forget about work. They prefer to be unemployed than unhappy or to unhappy. But that's the way it is. If you exert too much pressure, they will hand in their letter of resignation the next day. Health, safety, security, sustainability, meaning of life, it's more important to them than economic success. And this is a generation which uses YouTube. The most successful YouTuber is about 10 years old today. They also use Instagram and TikTok. Now you can take the photograph. Now the slide's complete. I think it's really, really interesting. There's so many insights, and I try to boil this down to the essentials. What's going to happen over the next 10 to 20 years? What will we be confronted with XYZ generations? Well, this generation, dear implant companies, which will still be there apart from us, of course, I think it's great what you do with your abutment. It looks similar to a titanium implant. Great approach to address today's generation, but it's not sustainable. These generations, the more we move towards Generation Z, don't really want you to fiddle around with implants. Generation X likes screws, etc. But think of what you saw yesterday with Josephine's surgery. Josephine doesn't like any screws. She doesn't like to fiddle around with abutments. She wants to shoot the implants in, full stop. They don't want any complex prosthetic restoration. They want closed aesthetic systems similar to the iPhone. And we are already worried about the camera peeping out here. If Steve Jobs were still alive, the camera would never protrude from the iPhone. He would never have allowed this to happen. To look aware in terms of with yoga lessons, Pamela Reif, millions of the trend, Dirk. 80% the trend, Dirk.
If I extract higher with late implants, so well, some people have a bone hand. We're always going to have a slight silent information with an overexpression of TGF beta, and which can impair the outcome. 2 millimeters rim incision we doing technique that he provides. It's been pulled, and on the other side, at some point, not all of the surgeries where we applied the BIS system really worked, but the biological implant generates better ISQs than local bone. So we have to change the way we approach these implants. Hollow spaces are healing chambers, and they promote angiogenesis, enable faster formation of healthy bone with a better outcome. The better tissue is vascularized, whether it's gingiva, bone, your liver, your skin, or your brain, irrespective of the tissue, the better the vascularization, the better the outcome of a tissue. Now here's a few extreme cases. Here we have a huge cyst with a fistula. We removed it and placed the implants immediately. We have 2 tempos here. But what I'm doing is here that I'm placing a biologically neutral material that does not promote inflammation. I sealed this off with PRF and placed my temporaries on it, and this is the second session. Removed the temporaries, prepared everything without anesthesia, scanned it, and placed the crown chair side. And I believe that this is what in 20 years' time the XYZ generation is going to be doing. This case proves nicely, you see the lateral image and the cross-section, that we have a huge defect, no septum left. We did an internal lift, and through this internal lift we stabilized the implant with 1 to 2 millimeters at 45 Newton centimeters. I filled the defect with PRF, no bone graft, no don't want a spacer. I want matrix information. I want something that promotes healing. Then I placed an umbrella on top of it. And if you look at the case now, that's pre and post-op, second session here, you will see that 14 millimeter of bone has regenerated here in this situation.
Und jetzt kommt noch mal eine Frage wieder.
And another question to you. What do you believe? You probably know. Which region is the region where you will be presented with the highest losses? Is it lateral, lateral teeth, front teeth, upper underjaw, upper jaw, lateral region? That's where the losses are the biggest. We adapted our protocol, our in-house protocol, in such a way that we now generate the most successes in this region. Why is that? This is what the data showed earlier. High loss rate, high failure rate in the premolar area. And quite often because of this here, I've sped up the film slightly. The compact bone is only paper thin. How am I going to stabilize my implant significantly? I don't stand a chance. But you see the handpiece stops. You see the ratchet here at 45 Newton centimeters. Where do I get my stability? I get it from the internal lift. We don't implant anymore. The upper jaw, we use internal lifts for the first molar, second molar, premolars, and the molars. I stabilize my implant in bone that there's just 1 to 2 millimeters thin. It's a fast intervention, simple intervention, easy to do. Once I've removed the tooth, I will prepare the entire width. I'm not going to do my lift immediately because you can't see into the socket properly. So prepare the socket to the entire width and then do the internal lift. And it's important to stay away 1 to 2 millimeters from the sinus floor. What you see here is that you have compact bone in this area, and the sinus floor always has compact, dense bone. Please always make use of this bone. Always use an internal lift in this region, but only go for 1 to 2 millimeters. If things go wrong, then you'll just have the implant slightly protruding into the sinus cavity, but nothing else will happen. So you fill a bit of PRF membranes into this area, which will then be used by the bone as a matrix to create new bone. This implant has a parabol-shaped shape, and it's going to engage in this bone in this area. Here's another case. At our clinic, we'll always do internal lifts as a standard procedure, and we get the same success rate as in the lower jaw. And why is that? Because the bone's better vascularized. I love soft bone when I manage to stabilize my implant despite this softness, and I'll do this with internal lifts. Now, another extreme case, the vestibular lamella has disappeared, it's gone. How am I going to stabilize this? With the upper second premolar, I need to do an internal lift. I do not only have a cyst in the apical section, but the entire vestibular wall has disappeared. But the sinus floor bone is stable, and that's where I'm going to stabilize my implant. And the apical portion of the implant is going to provide me with a 45 to 50 Newton centimeter stability. I don't need any bone substitute in this situation. I just place a bit of BRF on top of it, close the wound, and this is just to show you where we're placing this in the sinus floor. It's important to go all the way into the defect, maybe even further than this animation shows. I would go all the way here. The higher the walls are, the more bone I'm going to naturally generate. The higher the walls, the more narrow the gap, or the wider the gap, the more bone will be formed.
PRF alone will always be superior to bone substitutes, and I need a mechanically stable defect. And even if the full flap somehow moves into the surgical area, I will still have enough bone supply. Or if we place it buccally, the implant may osseointegrate, not that bad with ceramics because gingiva attaches properly, but it's not ideal. I was too fast here. Situation from A to B just by using PRF. The surgery only lasted 7 minutes. Why do it in a complicated fashion if you have a simple way to do it? The same works for the molar area. We remove the teeth. We don't even drill into the palatinal socket here. We perform an internal lift, again 1 to 2 millimeters, put in some PRF, and then screw the balcony implant into the socket. You saw the balcony implants yesterday, and the balcony provides the mechanical protection. It's an implant screw according to Schnell, and ideally the bone will then connect below the balcony. And we know from experience that this is going to work not to 100%. We have a failure rate of about 5, perhaps 7%, but we don't need a sinus lift. It's a bit like a free kick internal lift, and then 3 years later, the bone has fully regenerated around the implant. And everything so as to have it in generation, the baby boomer generation. I like what Neodent does and Ceramec does, because they will soon help win dentists over from titanium to ceramic. But 20 years from now, it will look different, because if we work with tissue level, we have no defined bone level. Sometimes the bone's like this or like this. With a tissue level implant, it doesn't really matter. But if we have an abutment system, the problem always is this gap here. How do we cement it? Can we cement it at all? When it is about prosthetic restoration, we have a natural tooth. We just use the diamond to shape the neck of the implant around the gingival level, and we just have one margin at the gingival level. And as soon as I have a situation like this to the right, I have to work below gingival level, subgingivally. The cement isn't that dangerous, but if we just have one gap, I'm just much more on the safe side. I'm much closer to what we do with our patients' crowns fitted on natural teeth. So again, it's about user experience. Today, I think this is a really intelligent concept, which hopefully will convert titanium believers to become ceramic believers. And we can see already from the big providers, it's all going in that direction. What about cementing versus screw retention? When I worked with titanium at the time, I bonded and screwed at the same time, because I didn't trust one or the other just by itself. In my presentations, I keep saying that I use cement for my restorations. Everybody said, goodness me, it has to be screw retained and needs to be, it must be reversible. Why? I've got to be able to take it down to clean it. Let's take a look at why you would have to, why you would want to clean. Well, the fact that you have a screw in there in the first place is the reason that you need to clean it. And the second argument, which I'm confronted with, well, I've got to be able to remove it in case of complications. What is the most frequent complication? Loosening of the screw, the abutment coming loose, or the prosthetic restoration coming loose. Again, the solution is actually the cause of the problem. And another criticism is, well, something might go wrong nevertheless, and I've got to be able to take it all down. But let's take a look at what we do every day. Thousands, tens of thousands, millions of natural teeth are restored with cemented crowns at tissue level. Now the question is, do I have a higher or lower success rate with implants? What would you say? Implants versus natural teeth. Highest, a very experienced surgeon is saying here, and that's precisely what we found. The studies show that with compromised patients, oral implants have a higher success rate versus natural teeth, because natural teeth can break as well. They might easily develop periodontitis, carious lesions, etc. Here's a beautiful example, even though it's a sad example as well. This is a patient that I treated, this is 5 years before, this is immediately after restoration, and this is 4 years post-operatively after serious drug abuse. She consumed heroin, she smoked pot before, which wasn't bad for healing, but then she went on to harder stuff. And all teeth were destroyed after 4 years of drug abuse. But we can see that the implants are the teeth that developed the fewest problems. A little bit of gingival recession, but otherwise they look great. So I firmly believe, based on my own experience, that we will move towards cemented restoration, because we don't want 90 or 85% of cases to provide solutions for 10 or 15% of cases. Take a look at the user experience again. We can take a diamond burr and simply prepare with water cooling without any anesthesia. Mr. Neugebauer also made the point in his presentation. We can do it, we're allowed to do it, we're approved for grinding and preparation, and we're much closer to the user experience that we've already had, and the future generations will have to live with that user experience again. Which brings us back to this photograph. The user experience the young generation would like to have is pretty much to the right-hand side. And I think the clock is ticking there already to the principle we saw on the left. This is what it looks like in an actual patient. And I'd like to summarize quickly what advantages I see for the user experience. It's extremely simple, equigingival, it's extremely stable, there is no gap, it's very close to natural teeth. Self-explanatory, no re-entry, no anesthesia. 1 to 3 sessions less, appointments less. It's less expensive, few components that are required. And a common friend responded to a presentation I gave in Frankfurt. He said, guys, we need to think about the fact that we may have to be able to restore this situation 40 years from now. And this is possible with this system. You can take the restorations off, scan them, and then produce new restoration. And I'd like to end with a last slide. It's an important observation we've all made. We don't quite know what term to use. It's gingival epithelial bond. And this is a photograph by Professor Rudelt, who placed this implant, and this patient had this implant in service for 25 years. This is this was a gift by Professor Rudelt to myself 20 years ago, and we know we've got this bond here. It's ectoderm, the outer germ layer. Germs wanting to attack here have to first attack the external germ layer before being able to attack the middle germ layer. If you have a gap, it's like a Trojan horse. They can attack the middle germ layer, the mesoderm, very quickly. It's a Trojan horse. This is the immunological door. It's the weakest point of access. There is no more direct access to the mesoderm. And Nevins showed the same thing, 2011, as did Oliva in 2016. This is how it works. One of the statements that impressed me the most, it's about 1 month old, is one of Sharam's statements. He said, with zirconium oxide or zirconia, you're implanting a biomaterial. And with this, I would like to close. I hope my hypothesis can now become your take-home message. Thank you very much.